Well, we started a new series this year that we're closing out this morning called What If, where we've been exploring how our lives might change if we make different intentional choices that impact our spiritual formation and the person we're becoming. A pastor and author, John Ortberg, once said, "The most important task of your life is not what you do, but who you become." And that's what we've been exploring, these choices we make that impact the person we are becoming. And today we're looking at part of the story of an Old Testament prophet, Daniel, best known for being a cat person, if you ask me, or being a Lions fan, if you ask any other Detroiter, but maybe not today. Now, the book of Daniel is filled with visions and stories representing two distinct genres, and it's also written in two different languages. The first chapter begins in Hebrew, where we're going to be today, and this is the sacred language for the Jewish people. And then it shifts to Aramaic, which was the secular language of that day before returning to Hebrew for the closing arc of the book. And this literary device seems to mirror the experience of God's people at the time that they were in exile. They were in exile under an oppressive ruler, Nebuchadnezzar, and the Aramaic language was the language of their exile. And it represented their experience as foreigners and outsiders waiting for their homecoming. So when the book shifts to their future back in the land of Israel, the language also returns to Hebrew as if to signal their homecoming with hope and expectation that this time of exile is not forever. Now, what's also interesting about Daniel's literary form is the use of chiasmus. And in narrative stories, chiasmus helps structure the story in a way that brings the focus to the middle, the turning point of the narrative, to draw the reader's attention to the pivotal moment. And this is something used all throughout the Bible, from the creation story in Genesis to the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew, where sections will mirror or contrast each other to point the reader to this center big idea, which in Daniel's book lands in chapter 7 with a message of hope that God's kingdom is coming. God's kingdom is coming and will never pass away. So, to a people in the midst of intense suffering under an oppressive and wicked ruler, the climactic point of the narrative is, hey, while we suffer right now, we hold on to a promise that God will make every wrong thing right. When you're wondering where is the justice and goodness of God, the message and hope of Daniel is hold on. God's justice is coming, as he points ahead to Jesus as the Son of Man coming, who will establish his kingdom that will be forever. I love how New Testament scholar Scott McKnight describes this central message of Daniel. He says, "All peoples, nations, and languages will together praise the sovereign, eternal King forever. Until then, the citizens of God's inaugurated kingdom, that's us, live in both exile and expectation, knowing that no matter how things look, God is in control, and his kingdom will most certainly fill the earth at just the right time." Daniel and we live in both exile and expectation. As we witness suffering and brokenness in our world, deep in our souls, we long for God to come with justice, to make wrong things right with the establishment of his kingdom. So the question that we have to wrestle with today is, what if I rise above the circumstances of exile with hopeful expectation? How might that change how we live right now? Now, when I speak of Daniel and God's people in this context being in exile versus what that exile means for us today, those are two very different concepts. For Daniel, it was a political, religiously, and spiritually oppressive exile under a wicked Babylonian king, while exile for us today and what we're talking about is knowing that our world, we as creation, are what the Apostle Paul describes as groaning in pain, awaiting God's ultimate redemption. That we see and experience the brokenness of sin, sickness, natural disasters, injustice prevailing, poverty, people not having access to shelter or clean water, and we know this is not how things are supposed to be. This is our world in exile. So let's jump into the passage today. We're going to be in Daniel chapter 1. So remember, this is beginning in the Hebrew language. And because we're going to be doing an overview of the entire first chapter today, as well as looking a little bit ahead to what's coming, you're going to notice some ellipses on the screen because I wanted us to get out of here at a good time today. So I would encourage you, if you have the Bible app on your phone or if you want to Google Daniel chapter 1, to follow along with me so you can see what little details I've left out that we were skipping over. It's still just a good practice to read along and see that. But this is Daniel chapter 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Jehoiakim of Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord gave King Jehoiakim of Judah into his power. So the narrative begins here in exile, and there are some significant details that the writer immediately makes clear. First, that Nebuchadnezzar has come and overthrown the current king of Judah, and this is bad news for God's people. But what the writer says is the Lord gave. The Lord gave. For the ancient world, a king's military victory was synonymous with his God's victory over the God of the conquered people. So the writer is clarifying immediately that Nebuchadnezzar's victory was in no way a victory over the God of Israel, who willingly gave his king and his vessels into the foreign king's hand. That God has not lost control or sovereignty, and that might bring comfort, but that also might bring feelings of anger and confusion when the wicked leader God has allowed to take place abuses his power with cruelty, violence, and oppression of the people of God. You might be wondering, the Lord gave? The Lord gave? And these are the questions that we ask in exile. We may not be under Babylonian exile right now, under the oppression of a prideful, cruel, and wicked ruler like Nebuchadnezzar, but what is true for us and has been true for all of human history is that every empire, every government is temporary. Every earthly kingdom will fall, and only one kingdom is eternal and everlasting and worth hoping in. And we feel the instability of earthly rulers and governments, not just as we look back at ancient and biblical history, but today too. Some recent headlines that I've read have been that Germany's government collapsed in December and France's did right before them. Justin Trudeau recently resigned as the Prime Minister of Canada. Haiti has been in crisis over gang uprisings and governmental paralysis, and Romania canceled their presidential election. Did you know that the average empire lasts around 250 years? And that doesn't mean that that is an expiration date for an empire, but that the average has become 250. And there's some like the Aztec Empire that lasted under 200 years. The Byzantine Empire lasted around 1,000. And then the Galactic Empire lasted about 24 years because Emperor Palpatine really ran that one to the ground. But the average is 250. And our country turns 250 next year. And that does not mean that that's the end of America as we know it and we better get our bunkers ready. But it's a sobering reminder that yes, whether in our lifetime or another, every earthly kingdom is going to come to an end and ultimately is going to give way to a greater, everlasting kingdom that we hope for. Because the kingdoms that we build are fragile, broken, and whenever and wherever you live, under whatever empire, they all fall short of the ethics and beauty of God's kingdom. So then the writer continues. The king commanded his palace master Ashpenaz to bring young men versed in every branch of wisdom to serve in the king's palace. They were to be taught the literature and language of the Chaldeans. The king assigned them a daily portion of the royal rations of food and wine. Among them were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah from the tribe of Judah. The palace master gave them other names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego. So Daniel and his friends are recruited to serve in this government, and they're taught the language and way of the Chaldeans, their oppressors. And this is what is so significant about the shift in language throughout the book. That here, as we're just beginning, we're seeing the writer holding on to the sacred language, but as Daniel and his friends are pressured to assimilate and learn the language, the book does too. They're immersed in the culture and ways of Babylon, even being given Babylonian names. Beginning the book in Hebrew for a short chapter illustrates their culture and identity being taken away from them in exile. Now, if you grew up in church, the names Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are probably familiar to you, or if you were discipled by VeggieTales like I was, you know them as Rakshak and Benny. We've got a picture of that there. Yeah, that might be familiar. I think it's fascinating that the church has typically latched onto these friends' exilic names rather than their sacred names when we tell their story, especially considering the spiritual and personal significance that your name held in that day and even does for us today. Think of how often God gave people new names. Abram to Abraham, Saul to Paul, but here their new names come not from their loving God, but their oppressor. So the dignity of being called by their name that is tied to their culture, heritage, and identity is not honored here. There's differing views on what these names could have meant. Some believe that they might have attached praise to a different Babylonian god or were simply used to mock them or other them in this context, but the writer is showing us at this point in the story that they are being taught the way of the oppressor. Learning their language, reading the literature, being called by new names, and then the king assigns them royal rations of food and wine. And interestingly, this is where Daniel chooses to push back. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the royal rations of food and wine. So he asked the palace master to allow him to not defile himself. Now God granted Daniel favor and compassion from the palace master. The palace master said to Daniel, "I'm afraid of the Lord, my lord the king. He's appointed your food and drink. If he should see you in poorer condition than the other young men of your age, you would endanger my head with the king." Then Daniel asked, "Please test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. You can then compare our appearance with the appearance of the young men who eat the royal rations." Now, I love this part because this is an ancient story of a vegan going to great lengths to tell somebody that they do get enough protein if you would just let them prove their point. So Daniel is the original biblical vegan who just loved to talk about being vegan. Now, as someone who is a little bit vegan, but technically vegetarian, I know that 90% of the experience is that we get to talk about being vegan. The attention is great. But this Thanksgiving, after the Lions won, sorry to bring up the past a little bit today, but after the Lions won, this video went viral of Jared Goff and others tearing into a turkey with a suspicious amount of legs. But David Montgomery picked up a carrot on the side and ate it. We've got that picture. And this is how many people, including myself, found out that David has been vegan since 2020 when he was playing for the Bears. And he, just like every other vegan you know, talks about how much stronger and healthier he is ever since making that change. So this picture is actually a really great visual of what Daniel was going through. These are the royal rations over here, and this is what Daniel and his friends chose to eat over there. But Daniel challenges the palace master to just give them vegetables and water for a few days and to compare their appearance with those eating the royal food. And it's peculiar that this is where they chose to resist. They didn't resist to their education or their new names. They submitted to almost everything in this pressure to assimilate to Babylonian culture, but the story is not that simple. The writer says that the king's food would defile them, and we don't have absolute clarity as to why, but it is believed that the food would have likely violated Jewish food laws or had been offered to idols. So this is an opportunity that Daniel sees for resistance. And this actually reminds me of what Walter said earlier about what inspired him and his family to march with Dr. King, that it was that principle of nonviolent resistance that represented the heart and ways of Jesus. And there's a few things about Daniel's choice that have struck me as I've wrestled with this passage. And first is that his choice is personal. Daniel asks for an allowance for himself Mishael, Hananiah, and Azariah. He does not ask for any of the other young men who are eating the royal rations to be required to follow this choice or for their royal rations to be taken away. This is Daniel practicing the spirit of self-control. It's not others' control. His personal choice will speak for itself as a witness to those around him, and he trusts God in that. And then second, his choice is compassionate. When the palace master expresses fear of the king, if Daniel and his friends were to appear weaker and for him to be found out, Daniel's compassionate towards his fears. Nebuchadnezzar was a cruel leader, so the palace master had a valid reason to be fearing for his own life. So Daniel's request was gentle and kind as he then instead asked the guard first for 10 days and even gave the final decision to the guard on whether he would continue to honor their request. Daniel doesn't force him to do something he's uncomfortable with or put him at risk. And then lastly, his choice prioritizes God's honor rather than his own. It's so interesting to me that Daniel and his friends accept their exilic names, because I've got what you could say is a complicated name. I've heard some really unique mispronunciations over the years. People have tried out nicknames that I do not like. And honestly, I grew up a little bit feeling like an outsider because of my name and not having any classmates with the same name as me. And I remember very clearly when I was 18, Timmy and I went on a mission trip to Honduras, and I met like 8 people named Tatiana. It was amazing. And they all said my name beautifully and pronounced it right. And the little girls named Tatiana were so excited to come and introduce themselves to me. It's like we had this immediate bond and connection. And then the cherry on top of all of that for me was that they made fun of my friends with classic American names, like Timmy. So it felt like I finally fit in and found my people. My name was honored and appreciated here. Now, the common consensus on why Daniel wouldn't eat the king's food is that it was sacrificed to idols, which would have dishonored God. The exilic names that stripped away their personal identity were not what they pushed back on. It's what would participate in idolatry. That's where they choose to draw the line. In the culture that we live in today, there are norms that just go against the ethics of God's kingdom, like greed, self-righteousness, self-promotion, participating in harmful gossip about others, and our resistance to these ways gives God honor. When we choose to give generously and help people in need without expecting anything in return, God is honored. When we humble ourselves and celebrate other people, joyfully giving away credit, how often does that happen in workplaces? God is honored through that. When we refuse to participate in conversations that tear other people down and instead our words are marked with kindness, compassion, and peacemaking, our lives quietly resist and choose the way of Jesus. This is what it means to be living in exile, but with expectation. But expectation of a greater kingdom coming. We live our lives now following the ways of Jesus. Now, Daniel's choice reflects selflessness and consideration towards others, reverence and devotion for God. And what we see next is how God showed up in his quiet resistance. So he agreed to this proposal. At the end of 10 days, it was observed that they appeared better and fatter, complement, than all the young men who had been eating the royal rations. So the guard continued to withdraw their royal rations and gave them vegetables. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and skill in every aspect of literature and wisdom. 3 times, the writer points out that the Lord gave. First, that the Lord gave Nebuchadnezzar military and political power. And then that the Lord gave Daniel favor with the leaders above him to even make the request that he did. And then to these 4 men, God gave knowledge and skill. Though the circumstances say otherwise, throughout the story, the writer is showing us how subtly God is moving, and this is why Daniel is a message of exile and expectation. We see that God gave these 4 men knowledge and skill. They stand out from the others, so Nebuchadnezzar meets them and finds them to be wiser and possessing greater understanding than everybody else in his entire kingdom. They're in exile, but God is still moving. This wisdom and favor that God is giving them is just the beginning of it. Now, a while ago, I heard from a friend about the concept of glimmers. A glimmer is a subtle, positive moment that sparks hope or joy, and the opposite of a glimmer is more well-known, a trigger. And we run into these when we see, read, or experience something that brings us back to a negative or traumatic event. And psychologists have done some research into glimmers and how beneficial it is when we become aware of when they're happening and then take the time to notice and appreciate them. A Henry Ford psychiatrist said it profoundly: glimmers are micro moments of awe, little things you notice during the day that make you feel calm and peaceful. Now, a couple of months ago, I was having a pretty rough day, and I decided that I needed some space to be with Jesus. And what I personally love to do when I'm struggling emotionally or feeling overwhelmed or despairing is to go be out in nature. When I surround myself with the beauty of God's creation, it reminds me that there is always goodness in our world, even if it feels hidden. I always hear Samwise Gamgee from The Lord of the Rings saying, "There's still good in this world, Mr. Frodo, and it's worth fighting for." Because how can you not believe that when you look out at Lake Michigan or Lake Huron and you see this clear, beautiful water as far as your eyes can see? There's still goodness in God's world. Now, it was a lucky day for a colder month in Michigan where the sky was perfectly clear, and I walked along the lake and was talking to God and praying and telling him about what I was feeling. And then I came to one of my favorite spots, which is this river that has these pine trees on the side. And when I got to the river, all of a sudden these clouds had rolled in, and the sky was dark and gray everywhere. And I felt pretty disappointed because the river just didn't look as beautiful to me as it did in the past when the sun was shining off of it and reflecting. But I looked around a little bit and I thought I saw this small clearing in the clouds and thought, maybe if I wait, it'll clear up. So I just sat still. I sat still there for 45 minutes, continuing to talk to God, and it did. The sky completely cleared up. The river was shining and beautiful exactly as I've seen it before, and I brought photo proof in case you think that I'm exaggerating about how dramatic of a shift it was. But this is also Michigan, so this is just every 5 minutes it looks a little different. But to me, this felt like a glimmer. This felt like God reminding me that though that moment for me felt like darkness and it was hard to see light and a hopeful path forward, he's still with me. If I wait a little while and don't give up, there will be a clearing in the clouds, and the sun will shine again. There is still beauty and goodness to hope for and work with Jesus for. This is expectation of the coming kingdom of God, while this side of eternity feels like exile. In a similar way, the writer of Daniel shows us these glimmers of God's hand at work. Amidst exilic oppression, the glimmers of God's faithfulness to bring his people home are there. Chapters later, Nebuchadnezzar attempts to violently murder Azariah, Mishael, and Hananiah, but God is with them and keeps them safe. And then after this, Daniel is the only one Nebuchadnezzar trusts and recognizes as able to interpret a dream he has that's troubling him because he sees the Spirit of God in Daniel. And it says that it's in great fear that Daniel chooses to tell him the truth about the dream. That even though Nebuchadnezzar is powerful right now, God is going to teach him that every human king is subject to a higher king. And God was going to take his kingdom from him, and this happens. He's driven away from human society just as Daniel foretold, and at Nebuchadnezzar's lowest point, he acknowledges the sovereignty of God. He says all his works are truth, his ways are justice, and he's able to bring low those who walk in pride like himself. But the exile didn't end when Nebuchadnezzar's reign did. That's simply the halfway point of Daniel, but it's a glimmer. That God is still sovereign, good, and caring for his people. To notice and hold on to God's goodness, this is expectation and exile. This is waiting for that clearing in the sky to hold on a little while longer. Because of the position that God provided for Daniel, starting in that first chapter in the king's palace where he refused to eat the royal rations, Daniel was able to say this before Nebuchadnezzar's humiliation. "Therefore, O king, may my counsel be acceptable to you. Atone for your sins with righteousness, and your iniquities with mercy to the oppressed. The purpose of God's people, the promise given to Jacob, was that all the peoples of the earth would be blessed through him and his offspring. God's people exist to be a blessing to all. This is clearly written into Old Testament laws that they would live differently for the sake of others. In Deuteronomy, God says, because he defends the fatherless and widow and loves the foreigner among them, giving them food and clothing, his people are supposed to live that way too. In Leviticus, God commands his people to leave the edges of their field unharvested so the poor and foreigner in their midst can gather food. And then in Leviticus 2, God also said, if your brother becomes poor and can't care for himself, you need to support him and have him move in with you. This is a different way of living, and here Daniel uses the position he's been given by God to live by God's way, advocating for righteousness and mercy for the oppressed. No matter how things look, the book of Daniel reminds us that God's kingdom will one day fill the earth, but right now, as we live in expectation, we do so following the ways of God's kingdom. The ways of Jesus' kingdom require living differently than the norms and ethics of any other earthly kingdom. In his kingdom, the poor are taken care of, even called blessed. And he challenged us to hold our earthly possessions loosely and even give all that we have generously to those in need, building treasure in heaven where it's eternal rather than on earth, here where it's going to pass away. In Jesus' kingdom, the sick are healed. The mentally and spiritually oppressed are not avoided, but cared for, liberated, restored, and seen. Children are welcomed and valued. Forgiveness is radically practiced over and over. Enemies are not only loved, but he says to do good to those who hate us. This is hard. This is so hard. These are the kinds of practices that sound really inspiring and beautiful and hopeful, but wow, are they hard to put into practice and really live out. Because how do we love enemies? How do we love enemies well when we live in an exilic world that keeps drawing more and more dividing lines of who's in and who's out, us versus them? Oh no. Are we good? Oh, I think we're good. But yeah, how do we do this? How do we live with compassion and empathy when so much around us is saying that we need to draw dividing lines? Now, before Jesus went to the cross, Peter cut off the ear of one coming to arrest Jesus. He was attempting to use violence to protect him, but Jesus stops Peter. He stops him and says, "No more of this," and then heals the man's ear. Even as Jesus is taken by the empire to be crucified, he practices the way of his kingdom. He says that it's one of peacemaking, not of violent retaliation. This act of Jesus showed us how we are called to live in expectation of the coming justice and reign of God, where all wrong things are made right. We choose his way now by refusing hatred, greed, violence, and judgment. Now, I love that as Daniel is telling Nebuchadnezzar of the suffering and humiliation that he's going to experience, that this grieves Daniel. Even to see an oppressive and prideful king, some might say, get what he deserved. Compassion wins in Daniel. This way of expectation of a greater kingdom does not rejoice in the suffering or humiliation of anyone, even our enemies. Now, earlier, as we heard Walter's story where his dad took him to march with Dr. King down Woodward Avenue, something struck me about why his dad chose to go. Walter said that his dad saw what Dr. King was doing and wanted to be a part of it. And we're celebrating the legacy of a man who saw that the exilic world that he was living in did not live up to the flourishing of every person that the kingdom of Jesus promises. So he chose to push back as a peacemaker. And this was not without resistance. He had a 75% disapproval rating at the time of his assassination. His fight for justice and equity for the vulnerable was not popular, but it was good. To see what Dr. King was doing and say, I want to be a part of that. I want my children to be a part of that is a beautiful testament to following the ways of Jesus' kingdom in hopeful expectation, even when it's unpopular. And these words from Walter made me think, for us today, what goodness do we see happening? And how will we be a part of it? What goodness do we see happening that God is drawing us to be a part of as an act of hopeful expectation of his coming justice? That this is the God who longs to make wrong things right and broken things whole. Now, a couple of months ago, I was reading Psalm 23, one of my favorites, and David the psalmist says, "Surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life." And I sensed God say to me, if I'm following you with goodness and mercy, don't you think you should be pursuing others with goodness and mercy too? From day one, God's people have been called to be a blessing of goodness for all people. The love and kindness that we've received from God is purposed to overflow so that we pursue others with that same goodness and mercy all the days of our lives. Because the promise in our exile is that God is with us. Despite what our circumstances look like, that common theme through Daniel is hold on. God is still here. God is still working. Hope is not lost. So give yourself to goodness a little while longer and the clouds will start to clear. And it can be vulnerable to hope and vulnerable to still look for the goodness that God is inviting us to be a part of with him as we walk through pain and see it in our world. But in that, we have the promise that while we pursue goodness and mercy, his own goodness and mercy is following us too. So as we live in this balance of exile and expectation, my challenge to all of us today is, what if we gave ourselves to the goodness that we see happening, that God is inviting us to be a part of? Because God will make all wrong things right, and goodness and mercy will have the final word. The clouds will part as we wait in expectation for that reality. So let's do so in partnership with Jesus, building that goodness right now in the world he loves for the people he loves. Let's pray. Jesus, I pray that right now your Spirit would start to speak to us about what goodness you are inviting us to build with you. God, I pray that you would stir hope in us. God, that even when circumstances or the world around us feels dark, that we would see your light breaking through, and that we would work with you to build something good and something beautiful, that we would know that we exist to be a blessing for our neighbors, for one another. So God, let us be known by that. Let us be known by our love and compassion and the way we serve each other. We love you, Jesus. It's in your name we pray. Amen.